All right. Yeah, so some of it was done with infrared, some done with just low light cameras. A lot of it shot with drones, which I guess when you're shooting in 40 below temperatures, it's a lot easier to just to sit in a vehicle and control a drone to go shoot than it is on some. But honestly, some of these shows anymore, this one was called Our Planet. I think it's on Netflix. Um, the work, the cinematography in them is just outstanding. Just I'd like to have posters of every frame of that film, like hanging on my walls. They're that cool. Well, it looks like we might be a little light today, which is a little disappointing because this class is probably more important than almost any other one. Of course, people can watch the recorded version of it, but like I said, they're not going to have any interaction um, beyond that. So let me make a few adjustments to my list here, and then we will get started. Okay. 2, 3, 4. All right. So we're going to do a couple of things today. We're going to review a couple of PDF files. One of them is all stuff that you've seen before throughout various stages, particularly early in the semester, just to get a little bit of a refresher on the things that you need to know. And then the second one, we're going to look at some questions. They're not formatted the way the test questions will be. They're actually formatted a little tougher. And so what I'm going to have you do when we do that, we're not going to, I'm not concerned about putting anybody on the spot or something like that, but you'll need a piece of paper and something to write with when we get to that point. Because what I want you to do, you'll write down, just, I don't know how many questions there are in this thing, maybe 20, 25 or something like that. But you'll just write down the number and you'll write down your answer to the question that you'll see on screen. And then when we show you what the correct answer is, I just want you to record whether you got it right or you got it wrong. And that way, when you look back and see which ones you got wrong, you'll know where you might need to look a little bit harder before the test, because those are things that are going to be on it. So let's may change my window here just a little bit, and I'll start sharing that. Oh, both of these files, by the way, are now they're on Sakai in the resources folder. I created a folder in there called test files, and these two files are in there. So you can download them. The other thing is that there are a couple of files in there that, well, the easiest thing would be, I would strongly recommend you just have internet access when you take the test, because some things would be great to have a hard copy of, but at least be able to access the files that are in the resources folder, because there are questions that will refer, those files will basically give you the answers. So you'll want to have access to that when you do those. So as a matter of review, we're just going to start looking first. This is really the core of the entire semester right here, this exposure triangle. And there's actually a better graphic of it than this one. This is not my favorite, but it shows you the three legs, which are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And each one of them, as we've talked about already, controls exposure, but each one also has another effect on the image. It has a visual effect on the image outside of exposure. So so each one, when you change it, you'll either double or cut in half the amount of light coming into the camera, but they also have another function. They have, the ISO, for example. As you raise that, it actually raises the noise in the image or the grain in the image. The shutter speed controls the motion in the image, whether things are frozen or whether they're allowed to blur, to give some motion to it. And the aperture controls the depth of field. It controls how much from whatever you focus on before and behind that is in focus. So those are the three visual things that the three of them do. So this is the chart that I actually prefer. And the one that is in, yeah, this is actually the one that's in the resources folder, because I've added the darker to the left and brighter to the right, just so you know as you change from one setting to another what it is that is happening as far as exposure. So for example, if we come down here and we say, okay, so for a given scene, these numbers would give you a correct exposure: f8 at a 60th of a second and ISO 800. Of those three things give you a perfect exposure. And you can see also the visual graphic, like above the aperture, you can see how the background becomes more in or out of focus depending on which direction you go. The motion above the shutter speed shows you how sharp or blurry that is. And the graphic above, the little stick figures above the ISO show you how noise increases as it goes up. So anyway, if we have this combination of the three legs of the exposure triangle giving us a perfect exposure, f800, 1/60th of a second and ISO 800, the question would be, if we then change the aperture from f8 to f5.6, what else would have to change? So there is a question on the test that's very much like this, and it gives you, each one is multiple choice. It'll give you 4 options. There is only one that's correct, and it should be pretty easy to figure out, right? So if you just look at this and you go, well, okay, from f8 to f5.6, I've gone one step brighter. So I need somehow the combination of the other two need to compensate for that by going a stop darker. So one of them could stay the same as it was originally if the other one goes a step in to the left. And it doesn't matter which one as far as exposure is concerned. Now there are other questions that, even though there may be more than one correct answer for exposure, and this is the tricky part, the way the question is worded should give you a clue. For example, if it says you're photographing something with a lot of motion, if you're photographing, for example, a race, a NASCAR race or a stock car race or something like that, and you change something and you have to change one or the other. For example, you now have to change your shutter speed. Typically, if there are 2 answers that are correct exposure-wise, you would be looking for the one that would probably freeze motion, so the one where the shutter speed would be faster rather than slower. So what I'm getting at is really read through the question and understand the situation that it's describing. So that will tell you which direction you might want to go. Is noise more of a factor? Is that more important? Or is shutter speed more important? Or is aperture more important? And give some weight to that. So for example, again, for this one, we look at f8, 160, 80, 800. We move the aperture to f5.6. What would have to happen to compensate for that is that, if the ISO stayed at 800, the shutter speed then would have to go down to 125 to compensate for that stop of brightness. There is more than one correct answer here. There's more than one way to achieve that, but on the test, there will only be one of those answers that's actually correct. So for example, you could have left the shutter speed at a 60th of a second and the ISO would have been 400. Hang on one second. Here we go. So, if all things are considered equal, then there should only be one correct answer. But if there is a situation or a scenario described in the question, then take that into account. It's there for a reason. Okay, that's just basically the rule of thumb that I'm giving you on that. All right, let's go back to this. So, and these are slides from one of the original presentations that we looked at, but I want to go over these 4 things because they are very important, and there's a lot of, a number of questions that'll determine, that'll be based on these. So white balance determines overall color balance. one of the things that some terminology that you may see on the test is a little bit different. And so when this question comes up about what white balance does or what it represents, the answer won't be as simple as determines overall color balance. So what does white balance actually do? When you white balance an image, what is it that you are actually doing that's causing the colors and the color balance to be correct? There's something very specific that you're doing to make that work. Can you think off the top of your head what that is? Because obviously you're not going to go through and adjust every color in the image. You're only doing one thing. Nobody want to take a stab at it?
You're looking for the neutral, aren't you?
There you go. That's exactly it. You're trying to neutralize and render the neutral colors accurately, because if the neutral colors are great, if they're accurate, then everything else will be accurate. Okay, so that's exactly right. That's what's happening there. ISO, like we've talked, the higher numbers mean less light is necessary to record an image, but it does include more digital noise. Shutter speed determines, it is actually physically the length of time that the shutters open, and it not only affects exposure, but the ability to hold the camera steady, also affects motion of the subject. Those are things we've talked about already today even. And then finally, aperture, also called f-stop. It's the diameter of the lens opening, and in addition to exposure, it's what affects how much of the image is in focus. There will be some questions concerning RAW files as opposed to JPEGs. And just so you know, RAW files they actually record way more data, way more information than a JPEG is capable of producing. Somewhere to the number of more like 8,000 times more information. So even if you're eventually going to be working not working on a JPEG, but you're eventually working towards a JPEG, a RAW file, when you have the ability to photograph that, is still your best bet, because now when you go into white balance it or adjust exposure or do any creative controls to it, you've got all of this information to work with. And the reason for it is that our eyes are really good at picking up flaws, but if we've got so much overhead to work with that even by doing the things we do, we reduce that amount slightly, our eyes still can't pick it up. But if you photograph as a JPEG and you've got a very small amount here to work with, and you're like, uh-oh, it's underexposed, color balance is off a little bit, you start shifting, that shrinks, and now our eyes are actually capable of picking up some of those problems. The biggest problem is one called banding, and it is where particularly where continuous toned images will break up somewhat. For example, if you think about a sky and an image that goes from a very light blue at the horizon to a dark blue at the top, some of you had some images on your last assignment that looked like that. Instead of being very smooth and looking like it was seamless, you might actually see some little blocky patches in there, and be able to see where those colors actually jump from one to another instead of very smooth. So RAW files, easiest way to say it, RAW files good, JPEGs bad. Not that JPEGs don't have their place, they're just an end result. They are an end product. They are the final step in the process. When you're all done with editing, then you can have your finished JPEG, because it uploads faster, it previews faster on a website. It's even printable without a problem, as long as you've maintained the integrity of the file up to that point. But what you don't ever want to do is take a JPEG file and edit it and process it. That should be your final step. If you have a JPEG, you're all the way done through the process, and you decide, oh, you know what, I want to go back and tweak something, you're better to go back to either the original file, or hopefully you have like a layered PSD file that you can go back to and just adjust what you need to adjust, and then re-export a JPEG. That's your best bet. Some examples of that: best case scenario with a JPEG on the left and then a RAW file on the right. You can see how much more detail is in the water. face, pretty much everything in that image has more detail on the right. Same thing here, particularly seeing it in the shadows under the chairs, the window, the light fixture that's hanging, and so forth. It's funny, I was just mentioning to somebody the other day about, I've forgotten where this was. It was a house I had to photograph. Was just talking about this doorway. It's a pocket door. It's this old mahogany, I think, wooden door that to open it, the door actually slides inside the wall. It's really kind of cool for an old house like this. House is probably, I don't know, 120 years old, something like that. Pretty cool. So white balance, David hit it. If it's about neutrals, if black, white, and gray are correct, everything else is correct. Okay, those are the only, and black, white, and gray, by the way, as far as digital imaging is concerned, it's all the same color. If your red, green, and blue channels all read very much the same number, it doesn't matter if they're all zeros, all 125, or all 255. If they're all the same, that color is neutral. And working with that color, or that, regardless of where it is, as long as it's not way at the extreme on either end, that's what you can use to color correct and to white balance your image. So you have a lot of choices for white balance on your cameras. You can use auto, okay? You can. You just need to be aware that even under the same lighting conditions, your color can change from image to image using auto, because auto is going to look at the scene and it's going to look at all the colors in the scene. So for example, even though the lighting on me would remain consistent, if I'm over here and you photograph this side of the room with the white background behind me, my skin tone is going to be a very different color than if you photograph me over here with the red background behind me. Lighting's the same, but auto white balance is going to see the difference in that color and it's going to compensate for that. So I'm going to be two different colors. Auto is still, for the down and dirty, for, quickly shooting, it'll get you in the ballpark more often than not. I personally don't use it except under very unusual circumstances. I typically set mine, if you look at the list, I set it to a color temperature. I've determined what the color temperature of my lights in my studio are through trial and error, and I set the camera, for me it's 5200 Kelvin. And so everything in my studio is automatically white balanced. I don't have to touch those. And anything that I shoot outside under roughly daylight conditions also is white balanced. But if I shoot inside, it's going to look very different. And I think I have a slide here. Yeah, this one, next one. So if I shoot with those settings in a church like this, the image on the back of the camera is going to look like it does on the upper left. But it doesn't matter, because when I bring those images into Camera Raw or Lightroom or whatever I'm using, I select all of the images from that ceremony, click on the aisle runner or something that's neutral in that image, and they all immediately look like the one on the right. So, but if I do want, so for example, let me give you a for instance. So occasionally at, let's say, a wedding reception, again, I don't really do these anymore, but when I did, not that you couldn't twist my arm under the right circumstances. But anyway, if I was going to work in a location for a reception where the light was going to change throughout the day, for example, we start and maybe there's a lot of windows and it's still light outside and we've got all kind of daylight flooding in, but maybe there's some incandescence, maybe even a little fluorescence somewhere. So I've got mixed lighting sources. And as it gets darker, that daylight becomes less and less intense and the other light sources pick up. So throughout the evening, my lighting in that room is actually going to change. I might shoot in auto just to give me a better looking preview on the back. It doesn't mean anything. I could still white balance those later, but rather than having to go through and do them all individually, I might only have to pick out a few here and there to white balance. So I would do that just for the sake of having a better preview. That's really the only reason. So ISO we talked about is basically, it just determines how low a light level you can shoot in. As you shoot in something like this, for example, if you get, this is like literally right after sunset and everything's starting to get really dark. If I don't turn the ISO up, if I don't bump it up, I'm not going to be able to record that scene. I'm certainly not going to be able to hand hold it. But you do pay a price. You can see the noise in the left side of the image, which is in the original, and then it had to be worked on in the right to smooth all of that out. So there's one thing about shutter speed that we talked about a couple of times, I think, and that's the hand-holding rule of thumb. This is where you find out how slow the shutter speed can be in order for you to typically get a relatively sharp image. So the first thing this says is on a non-imaged stabilized lens. Now what that means is that a lot of lenses, I would be surprised if any of you, a couple of you might, Chris, you might have one or two like this, I don't know. But most lenses, most consumer level lenses do not have image stabilization. It basically has a gyroscope inside that lens, and it feels motion left and right and it up and down in a 3D space, and it compensates for that to try to give you a sharper image handheld. So in this case, we're talking about a non-image stabilized lens, a regular lens, and you'll know if you have it or not because there'll be a switch on the side of the lens itself that turns it on and off, and it'll say image stabilization or something like that. It might just say IS, but that switch would turn it on and off. And there are times where you do want to turn it off. If you have it, you don't want that on if the camera's on a tripod. You can actually degrade your image a little bit more by doing it that way. But if you're hand holding, you certainly want it on. But on a non-image stabilized lens, it says keep the shutter speeds at the reciprocal of the lens's focal length. Oh, that sounds like like hello, da da, blah blah blah. What does that actually mean? So the example is that on a 500 millimeter lens, you could safely hold that at a 500th of a second, and a 50 millimeter lens could be held down to at least a 60th of a second. But any slower than that, you're going to risk camera movement. That number is higher on non-full frame cameras, but and you do, most of you I think are, if not all, are probably working on non-full frame cameras. So because of the fact that it actually multiplies the lens, the focal length of the lens. So for example, on most consumer cameras, if it says it's a 50 millimeter lens, the multiplication factor is usually somewhere around 1.6. So instead of a 50 millimeter lens, it's actually more like an 80 millimeter lens. So that's the number you would have to take into consideration, in which case a 60th of a second might be a little too slow. You might have to bump that up to 125. And some people are better than others. Some people, can hand hold a camera a little more stable. There are some little tricks that you use. Leaning against a building helps keep your body from moving. Breathing out, like not heavily breathing out, but exhaling as you're pushing the button rather than hold your breath. If you hold your breath, you're going to find that you actually move more. But doing a slow exhale on a long exposure, if you're trying to hand hold, generally works really well. And this is an example of why you would use a long shutter speed, giving the light trails time to burn out. This is probably a 15th of a second, an 1/8 of a second, something like that, maybe even a little slower. And it's cool. You can see the lights like down in the lower left-hand corner, how they starburst. That's not a filter. That's what happens when a lens is stopped down a little bit. And that's actually sort of a reflection of the aperture of the lens. So the aperture, again, we talk about depth of field being the actual definition of that is how far in front of and behind the area of critical focus does apparent focus exist. Let me explain what I mean by that. Critical focus is what you actually focus on, okay? And it's if you're taking a picture of me, you're going to focus on my eyes probably. That's your best bet. And so it's almost like a pane of glass in front of you. that your focus is actually on one point and one point only. But depending on how high an f-stop you have, or how small rather, it extends that apparent sharpness a little further. And I think we have some numbers somewhere on this. Maybe not, so I'll talk about it here. We've talked about how far that is. It does change based on the lens, but typically acceptable sharpness is 1/3 in front of what you focus on and 2/3 behind. So that's something important to remember. 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind. So the higher numbers, f11, f16, f22, you're going to have more apparent focus. Lower numbers like f2, f2.8, you're going to have less in focus. And there's an example of that on just looking at the left one and the right one. You see the one on the right, the background is very much out of focus. The one on the left, you're starting to see a little more detail in those faces that are more towards the background. Some examples of this: shallow depth of field. Almost doesn't matter what's behind the subject here. It just becomes a color and a shape. And so that's one of the reasons why you would use a shallow depth of field. So let's talk about histograms. Give me 1 second here. What are they and how do you read them? So looking at this histogram, would you say that this is more than likely a low key image or a high key image?
I'll say low key.
Yeah, and it's because, again, you're looking at the middle of that range where it says 1.00. Those are your midtones. The left side are the low tones, the right side are the bright tones, and most of this image, most of the pixels in this image are darker than middle gray. So that would definitely be a low key, and that's an example of it right there. That's the actual histogram for that image. So conversely, a high key image like this, you're going to see the pixels shifted to the right-hand side. Some of the other things we may discuss, the test may touch on, are the automatic and semi-automatic modes. Again, you don't have to worry about all of these because really there are only 3 of them that I ever use. And one is manual, one is aperture priority, and one is shutter priority. And honestly, I very seldom use shutter priority because you can achieve the same results working in aperture priority. So if I'm in the studio, I'm shooting manual. If I'm shooting something where I want complete control because of an effect, I'm shooting manual. But for the most part, if I'm doing portraits and I'm outside, I'm in aperture priority. I'm typically setting that to a very wide aperture, f2.8, letting the background blur out of focus to keep more impact on my subject. But those are the only 3. Program is not one that I really recommend at all because you just don't know what the camera's doing. It's like shooting with a cell phone. It's going to make a lot of adjustments and a lot of guesswork, but you're not going to be able to control any of the elements. You're not going to control the amount of noise. You're not going to control the shutter speed or the depth of field. It's going to guess and do all of that for you. The other 2 give you the options to control those. Oh, by the way, stop me anytime. If you have a question about anything that we're talking about here, don't let it pass. This is the time to do that, okay? We'll also talk a little bit about lighting, not all of this, but some of this. It's basic lighting at this point. So if I talk about quality, light quality, what I'm talking about essentially is the size of the light source in relationship to the subject. So again, the bigger that light source is in relationship to the subject, and that's a very important line because the sun is the biggest light source there is, but it can be a very small pinpoint hard light source. It creates harsh shadows, unlike a soft light. Conversely, a light that's this size could create way softer shadows than the sun, even though it's nowhere near the size, simply because it's closer to the subject. So What determines quality of light is the size of the source in relationship to the subject. That's the important part. Why we even use it, why we even worry about shadows, is because that's how we show 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional medium. We're only looking at height and width when we look at a photograph. We're trying to convey depth, and shadows and shadow is the way to do that. Now, the inverse square law is not something that we'll really, we're not going to get into in depth. All you need to know is that what it says is that light falls off very quickly from the source, and there is a graphic for that. So for example, if the bottom row of numbers 0 to 10, if those are feet away from the light source, you can see that at 1 foot, if that's 1 unit of light, at 2 feet, you would think that that would be a half of unit of light, but it's not. It's actually a quarter, meaning that the light falls off way faster than what you would think physics would actually allow. And as you go to 3 feet, now we're at a 1/9, and at 4 feet, you're at a, instead of a quarter, you're down to a 1/16 of the output of that light. So what you need to remember from this is not so much the law itself or any of the numbers. Just remember that light falls off much faster than you would think mathematically that it does. 2 feet away is not half of the light, it's actually a quarter. So for direction and quality, again, we talked about, good lighting being designed to show 3 dimensions. You need those shadows to be able to see the roundness in a face or in an object. If you think about shooting a beach ball or something like that that's very round, or a globe, if the light source is right at the camera, you could very well be looking at a two-dimensional object. You wouldn't really know for sure unless the light's coming from an angle and creating some shade and some shadow across the surface of that. Then our brain can subconsciously pick up on that. So like we've said already, soft light will produce softer shadows. Hard light produces harder shadows. So obviously we've got a, in relationship to the subject, the light on the right is a very small light source. And you can actually see that. I don't know how well you can see detail here, but if you look at the reflection in the eyes, the image on the left, the light source is actually taking up about half of his eye on the top from one edge to the other. And on the one on the right, it's a very small point source. So you can tell sometimes by looking at the reflection in someone's eye, not only where that light was, but how large it was. So we did composition. You guys seem to do pretty well with this. I don't think there was a lot of problems with it. These were the 10 or 11, however many there are, of the compositional elements that we looked at. Rule of thirds, balance, contrast, leading lines, convergence, use of diagonals, framing, perspective, simplicity, symmetry, and viewpoint. Got it all out in one breath. And then there were some examples of that. So rule of thirds is simply dividing the image into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and placing your subject on one of those impact points, those 4 impact points where those lines intersect. We've been rewriting some of the questions on the certification exam for professional photographers. And this was a tricky one about, what terminology to use as far as, what these lines, what to call them, what they mean, what they represent. But the easiest way, I think, for me to remember is just that there are 4 impact points created by the intersection of those lines. Same thing here. The dominant eye, which is the one closer to the camera here, is very close to that. And also his body's entirely moved over to that right vertical third, giving room for his view, place for him to look to the left. Same thing here, dominant eye right on the impact point. Same thing here. The image is in the lower left quadrant. Same thing here, just different points. And this, some of these images use more than one compositional element. This one could be simplicity, it could be balance, it could be, you know, there's a perspective. There's a lot of them that you could use here. Balance is about balancing typically two, but sometimes more elements that are in a photograph against each other. And typically you're going to find those at diagonals. You're going to find them like this or like this for balance to really be used. So on the test, you're going to look at a bunch of images, and it's going to say which compositional element is represented by this image. And even though there may be some where there's more than one correct answer, or you know, could be stretched into a correct answer, there should be one that is I would say more pronounced if you know exactly what those elements represent. So this is balance as well. It's rule of thirds as well, but because we have two elements in the image, that's why I would shift this one to balance. If the bridge didn't exist and it was just the girl in the water, then absolutely rule of thirds. But the fact that the bridge is included, I think we're looking at balance here. Contrast, which includes color contrast, contrasting colors, reds and greens are on opposite ends of the color wheel. There is a color wheel that's been uploaded to Sakai. I would definitely make sure you have access to that. We may ask some questions relating to that because we, and again, you guys did pretty well with it. We just want to make sure that that you don't you don't mess up. If you have it right in front of you, it'll be a lot easier to do. Leading lines, this one's pretty simple. That again, leading the way we read from left to right. So coming in here from the lower left, that line leads us all the way through the image and back out through the upper left. Same thing here. And we talked about an image like this being stronger compositionally if we flip it. And it's just because we read left to right. There's nothing wrong with this, but subconsciously in Western society, this just feels right. It feels better to most of our brains, unless we're somewhat dyslexic, in which case that one might be better. I don't know. Apparently I'm not dyslexic because I like this one. Using light to create leading lines. Again, these are lamps on a train, long exposure. So why didn't the train record? Why do we see the tracks? We see the lights from a train. We don't see the train. Why is that?
Shutter speed.
So tell me more about that. What would you say? You know, just take a guess. Let's say this was just a locomotive. Okay, there was no car or cars attached to it. It was just a locomotive traveling at, I don't know, let's say relative clip for those things might be 25 miles an hour. So just a locomotive traveling at 25 miles an hour, what would you guess would be the shutter speed that was used for this? Nobody wants to take a stab? Well, I wasn't looking for an exact number, but I can, the answer I was looking for is that obviously it was long enough that it started before the train came into the picture, and it was still open when the train left the picture. Not only because of where we see the lights, but because the train itself didn't record. So let's say this was a 30-second exposure. So in order to get proper exposure, each part of this image needed to be exposed for 30 seconds. Well, with a train moving at 25 miles an hour, it was, you know, let's say the lower left-hand part of the image, it only occupied that part of the frame for a couple of seconds. So if we needed 30 seconds to get an exposure and it was only there for say 2 seconds, then it didn't, that's why it didn't record, because 28 of the 30 seconds, there was nothing but the background there. And that's how you get things that are present to not record, by going with a very long shutter speed. Think about areas that are heavily populated with people. if you can shoot, if the people are in motion, if they're walking or moving or whatever, if you can shoot with a long enough shutter speed, those people will not record. You'll only get the buildings, the interior, whatever it is that you're shooting, and not the people. So, you know, it's important to know that. For me, for example, if I'm hired to go in and photograph something and they say, well, look, we can't really disrupt anything. We can't, you know, ask patrons to move. We're conducting business, whatever. You have to find a way to shoot this room with people in it. That's what I would do. I would probably use neutral density filters or something over my lens that maybe I'd go down and get put it on a tripod and shoot for 30 minutes to get the exposure that I wanted. And in 30 minutes, there's a good chance that none of those people would be in the same spot and therefore wouldn't record. So just one of those tricks that you need to know in order to achieve the result. Convergence. Now, again, when we talk about the very similar compositional elements, you could say that this is leading lines as well. But the difference between convergence and leading lines is convergence will generally lead you to a specific point somewhere in that image, whereas leading lines may lead you through an image and you just follow those. So technically it is leading lines, but convergence is stronger because it leads you right to a single point. And this, you know, again, pretty much the same thing, because those that spiral is taking you to a specific point up those steps. Same thing here. You could say this is rule of thirds. It is. This could be leading lines, which it is. In this case, and I wouldn't use an image like this probably on the test, because I'd say that both of those are probably as equally correct, and I would have to reward both of those with the correct answer. Again, obviously a leading leading lines here, and then flipping that image so that we use that line to lead us from left to right. So this is convergence again. Even though we don't have a subject here, all of the lines that we're looking at down this tube, down this subway platform, lead us to that one point right smack in the center of the image. Use of diagonals, changing an image from that to that. Framing, that's a pretty simple, pretty obvious one. Picture within a picture basically is what you're looking at. Again, framing, 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 and framing. Still framing. And so the subject doesn't always have to be the background or in the background in order for framing to be used. Perspective and viewpoint are very similar. Again, I'm looking at perspective on these because of the angle that they're shot at. Simplicity, again, you could say rule of thirds and you would not be wrong. But simplicity is probably a stronger one in this case because there's just so little here other than that bird. Same thing here, both would be accurate. And this could be viewpoint as well. Symmetry, that's a little easier to understand. Remember, symmetry does not have to be perfect. That trash can on the lower right and the fact that the window boxes aren't exactly the same doesn't matter. Symmetry, convergence, leading lines, lots of different ones here. And again, symmetry does not have to be left and right. It can also be top and bottom. So in this case, we've cut the horizon line right smack in the middle of the image, and we're symmetrical top and bottom. Clearly leading lines. I do think this is Bali, and I want to be there like within the next few years. I want to go here. Not to this place. I've seen some really, really cool huts on the water that are way better than these. That's where I'm going to set my sights. But man, that water is just, my only problem is if I go there, what's my incentive to come home? That's a tough one. We talked about using old masters inspiration as compositional elements. The triangular shapes, triangles and diagonals are utilized quite a bit in both in painting and sculpture, as well as photography. Even in architecture, you'll see some of this. Again, building these triangles, not having adjacent heads on the same level. So mom and the little boy are staggered, mom and dad are staggered, dad and the daughter are staggered. And even if mom and the daughter were on exactly the same level, they're not adjacent heads because we have heads in between them. And the same thing here. You could say dad and the boy in the middle are adjacent heads, but they're not, because mom is the one, she's in between the two of them, even though she's on another height level. That keeps them from being adjacent heads. And it not only builds an overall triangle, but we have several triangles within that. Creates a very strong composition. Even the reason for the knees being bent the way they are is to create triangles. We got rule of thirds on the right hand side, and in a photograph, and in paintings on the left hand side. Some common mistakes. So this is one that is used a lot. This is a lot of selfies are done this way. Using a bad focal length, a cell phone even with a wide lens very close to your face is going to create some distortion. In this case, it's very close to the subject on the left, so it makes his nose look larger than it is. On the one on the right, his hands look large, and his face, everything about the image is skewed a little bit. Actually, that image is pretty disturbing in the first place. Never really paid much attention to it, but why does this dude have this machine gun set up? I don't think I want to know. Anyway, mergers, things growing out of people's heads in the background. That's where you have to, get to the point where when you're looking through the camera, you see more than the subject, and you don't look at it in 3 dimensions, because that's the way our brains are seeing it. We have to sort of preview it in 2 dimensions, and that's when these things become apparent. Oh, we've got this tree growing out of this guy's head. Horizon lines, if you've got water especially, anything that's a lot off is off intentionally. Anything that's off a little bit is a mistake. Finally, the dust on the sensor we talked about. I think we talked about this. Not changing lenses with the camera powered on or the camera tilted up. When the camera's powered on, the CCD sensor is actually like a dust magnet. It'll attract dust to it, so you don't want to have the camera turned on with the lens off. Image corruption is another big one that I see a lot. Don't take the camera or the card out of the camera with it turned on. Format the card every time you use it in the camera. Don't erase the files. Actually format, because that actually replaces the software on the card, and that's the biggest cause for image corruption is corrupted software. And I do recommend that you transfer images using a card reader. They're very cheap. You can buy them at Walmart for $5 anymore. But don't use the camera. You could run into some issues there. And finally, for focusing, just know what focus point is being used. Know what it is when you push the button that the camera is focusing on, and that'll alleviate a lot of that. All right, so I tell you what we're going to do. It says spring, but it's actually not. Rather than take a break, why don't we just go through this part of it, and we'll get out a little early. Does that sound like a plan? So this is where you're going to need to write your answers down. They're not multiple choice. They're not formatted that way here, although they will be on the test. I wanted to make this part just a little tougher for you, but we're not going to ask you what you wrote down. I just want you to record these so that you can look at this file later and see which ones you got wrong and know exactly what you need to bone up on a little bit. So let's look at these. First question is, what does changing the ISO on your camera do? Now, there are 2 things that it does, but we're not going to focus on the noise at this point. We're not going to focus on the fact that it increases digital noise. So I'll give you a minute to figure out how to word that. Tell you what we'll do here. Do you have, if you guys have this, if you can see the participant list, you should be, or is it chat? I'm not sure. Let me look here. It's in one of those windows. Do you see a hand, like to raise your hand? Do you see an icon for that? If you see that, you should, it's either in one of, it's in one of those, I have a different window than you do. But there should be one in there for raising your hand, and I can't bring the chat window up, so I can't see if it's in there.
It's in participants.
Participants, okay. So when you have the answer, when you think you're ready, just raise your hand, and that way I'll know when it's time to move on. I'm going to go ahead and move on now because I think you guys have all had enough time. But from now on, just raise your hand, and then I'll put it down for you, and I'll just know when to move on. So, what does changing the ISO do? Let me get my thumbnails up so that I can move this. Okay, so it either makes the image lighter if the numbers are higher, or it makes it darker with the numbers that are lower. So if you got that right, give yourself a little check. If you got it wrong, put an X over it. And when you'll have to look at this PDF file that's in the resources folder to compare it against your answers to find out what it was you got wrong or right. But that is what the ISO does. So the next question, so pretty much just gave you this one, but an higher ISO number will allow for shooting in lower light. What potentially negative effect can it have on the way an image looks visually? And like I said, just raise your hand if you can on the participant window. All right, it looks like we've all got it. And like I said, the answer I pretty much gave you was it can add noise to the image. Higher numbers are going to give you more noise. Next one is, which of the following apertures is physically larger, meaning a wider aperture? So this, if you look visually, this would be a small aperture. This would be a wide aperture. Which number is a larger or wider aperture? Oh, this is cool. When you put your hands up, it actually reorders you and puts you at the top of the list. That's neat. I didn't know it did that. All right, looks like we've all got it. The wider of those is f2.8. So again, the smaller numbers are wider apertures. The higher numbers are narrower apertures. So if you're currently taking pictures with your aperture set to f8, but you want the background to be more out of focus, would you change it to f4 or f16? Chris, I think yours are like when you put your hand up, it like goes for a second and then disappears. I'm not sure why, but I did you. I mean, clearly you're done. So uh, I'm just trying to keep an eye on that. Eva, I didn't see yours. Are you still working on it?
Nope, I got it.
All right, let me lower these. All right, so the answer for that is F4. So again, what the wider apertures will create shallower or less depth of field, the higher numbers will create more. So if your images are coming out blurry because of camera movement, now again, remember that the clues are sometimes in the way the question is worded. What do you change to fix that? The clue is that your images are blurry because of camera movement. So what would you do to fix that? And there actually are two correct answers for this. All right, good. I think we got them all. You can either make the shutter speed faster or use a tripod. Those are the two things that will minimize camera movement. All right, moving on. You're shooting in full manual mode and your shutter speed is 1/125th of a second. You accidentally bump it to a 60th of a second. Will the images now be brighter or darker than they were before? All right. Give me a second to lower those. And the answer is brighter because if you were at 1/25th and you go to 60th, that's letting in twice as much light, so the image would now be brighter. All right, so we have to stop talking about Amelia because she's here now.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I got your email earlier, so don't
Yeah.
worry.
Well, I mean, that wasn't it. This is entirely user error. I completely lost track of time. I'm so sorry.
Oh, well, then in that case, we're docking you.
That's fair.
Well, the good news is that I did remember to record this, so you haven't missed anything. It's all going to be there.
Okay.
All right. So what we're doing right now, Amelia, just so you know, I want you to write down what you believe is the correct answer to the questions that we're going to show here. And then when I show the correct answer, just simply mark whether you got it right or you got it wrong. And you can compare on your own later on to find out, what it is that you might need to look up a little bit more. This file that we're looking at, this PDF file, is in the resources folder inside a folder called test files. So you can use this to compare later on. We're actually on like question 6 or something right now. So, but you can pick up on the recording later on. All right, so now again, you're shooting in full manual mode and your aperture is f5.6 and you accidentally bump it to f8. So similar question, will the images now be brighter or darker than they were before? We're just dealing with aperture instead of shutter speed. Oh, and Amelia, what I've asked them to do is once you've written down your answer, in the participants window, there's an icon for you to raise your hand. Oh, did we lose? She's there. Just raise that hand so I know when everybody has written down an answer and we can move on.
Okay.
All right, everybody looks like they have it. So the answer is darker. Going from f5.6 to f8 is going to create a darker image. So again, you'll have access to the chart that shows you that. So questions like that should be really, really easy. Those are ones that if anybody misses, I'm going to be like face plant, you know, in the palm of my hand because it's really right there in front of you in black and white. So hopefully that doesn't happen. All right, so your current settings are f8, a 60th of a second, and ISO 200, and that gives you a properly exposed image based on the light levels you have. You want to change your aperture to f4. What else has to change and by how much to keep the exposure correct? Now here again, there is more than one correct answer, and these are the numbers that we're looking at. So we're at f8, a 60th of a second at ISO 200. That's for correct exposure, but you want to change from f8 to f4. So what else would you change and by how much? This is a little trickier. Take a little longer with this one. So clearly we're changing the aperture already. And so what you're looking at are shutter speeds and ISO and or. Sometimes you can do it with one, sometimes you'll do it with both. And again, there is more than one correct answer here. Good, everybody's got an answer. Let me lower the hands. So one possibility from that is, okay, so I'm just showing you we went from f8 to f4. One possibility, you need to decrease the exposure by 2 stops, okay? Because what we did is we increased the brightness from f8 to f4 by a factor of 2. So you need to decrease by a factor of 2 by either changing the shutter speed to a 250th of a second, decreasing the ISO to 50, or doing half and half. You would change the shutter speed to a 1/25th and the ISO to 100, each of which changes the exposure by 1 stop. So we're looking for 2 stops of adjustment. Whether you get that all in 1 step or 2, it's totally up to you at this point because we haven't given you any information about what you're photographing. So all of them are pretty much considered equal at this point. So those are your answers. Just curious, how many are willing to say they got it right? I'm not seeing any hands go up. Yeah, this is one of the toughest. These exposure triangle questions are the toughest ones, and I would say over the length of time that I've been teaching this class, I would say a good 80% of the people get this wrong. So really, you know, have that chart by you when you do this, and just, it's a very simple thing really. When you look at it, you're like, okay, we went 2 stops this way, something has got to go 2 stops the other way, and it can be all in 1 step or it can be in 2. So next question, you're shooting handheld in manual mode with settings of ISO 200 at f8 and a 30th of a second. The images are too dark, meaning your exposure is not correct, but you don't want to change the sharpness of the background. What is your best option to fix it? So you're too dark using these settings, and I don't know if I have, whoops. Yeah, you're too dark at those 3 settings. You don't want to change the sharpness of the background. So what is your best option to fix it? Now, the clue here is the way the question is written. You're shooting handheld. That's a clue. Remember that. So even though there's more than one correct answer, the question is actually, what is your best option? All right. Looks like we got one left. There we go. And so some of these are a little tricky, and they're intentionally that way because I want you guys to have to think a little bit. The best option is to change the ISO to a higher number like 400. You could slow the shutter speed down, but you're hand holding and the shutter speed's already at a 30th of a second. So if you change that to a 15th of a second, then you run the risk of having a blurry image. So that's why, even though it's correct exposure wise, it's not the best option. The best option is to change the ISO. All right, next up, you're photographing a merry-go-round and want to show a little motion blur in the image. Would you use as a starting point for your shutter speed 1,000th of a second, 125th of a second, or 15th of a second? Now, we don't know how fast the merry-go-round is moving, but we assume that it's not fast enough to throw little children into the arms of their parents who are watching on the side. So again, what would you use? We're asking for a starting point. Of these three shutter speeds, what would you start at and see if it's correct? All right, looks like we got everything. Wish there was a way. There's probably a way to, maybe there is. Oh, there is. There's a clear all. I can do it that way. So the starting point would be a 15th of a second. Again, we don't know how fast the merry-go-round is moving, but a 15th of a second is almost guaranteed to give you some motion in the image because it's fairly slow shutter speed. If it's too slow, bump it up, go to a 30th, whatever, go to a 60th, depending on the speed of the merry-go-round. But 125th, even on a merry-go-round, is probably going to give you a relatively sharp image. You might have a little motion in it, but you may not get the effect that you're after at that speed. So that's why 15th would be a good starting point. So which of the semi-automatic modes on your camera would you use if the sharpness of the background was the most important thing to consider? Aperture priority or shutter priority? So you either want to blur the background or you want it to be very sharp. All right. You would use aperture priority because, again, that is where you set the aperture, you set the f-stop, which is what directly controls the sharpness of the background. And the camera will pick the shutter speed based on the lighting conditions in your ISO. Next one is you're photographing a large group of people lined up in 4 rows from front to back. Which row should you focus the camera on? And this is something we just talked about a little bit ago as far as depth of field is concerned, about your area of that plane of focus, that plane of glass that you actually focus on, and how much in front of and behind is in focus from that. So if you have 4 rows of people, but you want them all to be relatively sharp, which row would you focus on? All right, cool. The answer would be the second row. Because again, apparent sharpness is 1/3 in front of what you focus on and 2/3 behind. So if you focus on the back row, front row is not going to be very happy. They're going to be a bunch of blurs. If you focus on the front row, you'll go a little further. First and second rows will probably be okay. Third row might even be a little bit acceptable, but fourth row is going to be out. So second row, or even if you find something between the second and third row, that would be your best bet. You're photographing, same question, photographing a large group of people lined up in 4 rows front to back. Which aperture would you be more likely to use, f5.6 or f11? Looks like we got one more here. All right. Okay. It would be F11. It would give you more apparent depth of field and sharpness. So, and honestly, if I can, with the lighting conditions, I'm probably going to go even more. I'd go to F16 if I have the lighting conditions to do it, or if I have the light with me. The higher that number is, the more of that image is going to be in sharpness. And boy, you learn this really quick when you go out and shoot a reunion, because a reunion is, it's like herding cats is pretty much what it's like. To try to get everybody to shut up long enough and look at the camera. And you've got all this technical stuff you're trying to work out. Where are you focusing on? Is everybody in? Are they in far enough that as an 8x10, they're not going to be cropped off? You know, there's all this stuff going on in your head. And you don't want to mess this up, because if there's, 80, 100 people in that picture and half of them end up being out of focus, you got a lot of money in your pocket that you're going to be giving back. And that's not a fun thing. Next question, you're shooting handheld with a 24 millimeter lens. Both of the following exposures are correct for the scene. Background sharpness is not an issue. Which one would you pick and why? So the clues here is that your handheld 24 millimeter lens, you don't care about the sharpness of the background. So why would you pick one over the other? Okay. My answer for this is an ISO 800 f8 and a 60th. A lower ISO will give you less noise, and a 60th of a second using a 24 millimeter lens is still fast enough that you're not going to get camera blur. Now, again, you may find in actual practice that it's easier for you to keep the shutter speeds as fast as possible, and that's fine if that's the case. But this is more theoretical, and so the clue was that you had a 24 millimeter lens. I gave you that specifically so that you would know, using that handhold rule of thumb, that a 60th of a second is going to be plenty fast enough. Same issue. You're shooting handheld with a 24 millimeter lens, ISO 200 f8 at a 30th of a second. The images are too dark, so your exposure is not correct, but you're afraid that slowing the shutter speed down will make the images blurry because you're already at a 30th of a second. So what do? You want to brighten that image up, but you don't want a slower shutter speed. So you're going to be looking at either your ISO or your aperture. All right, everybody's in. Let's see, so ISO 200 f8 at a 30th. Yeah, those are the numbers that you're at. So you would either increase the ISO to 400 or change the aperture from f8 to f5.6. So again, that's going to give you one stop of brightness either way. And in the case of the question, we didn't talk about anything other than shutter speed. So those are your answers. What does white balance do? And we talked about this almost at the very beginning. All right, so it neutralizes color casts and makes all colors appear natural. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're neutralizing the grays, the blacks, and the whites, and that in actuality will actually make all colors appear natural. That was an easy one. So how do you white balance a raw file in a raw file processor like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom? What's the actual procedure in the software to white balance an image? And we actually talked about this a little bit ago when we were looking at the image inside the church. Okay. You click on anything neutral in the image. Yep. Anything that's black, gray, or white, or is supposed to be black, gray, or white, as long as it's not totally black or totally white, click on it and bang, you're white balanced. So actually, we've already talked about this. What does neutral refer to in the previous image? It's black, gray, or white. We talked about that. So we don't, you might want to write down that answer just so when you look at these later and compare them against this, you're not missing one. It might throw you off a little bit. But that question is, what does neutral refer to? Black, gray, or white? Next one up is, what is the slowest standard shutter speed you should try to hand hold the camera at if you're using a 50mm lens? And again, we talked about this a few minutes ago as well. All right, it would be a 60th of a second. So you want to go as close to that focal length, but not under. So I wouldn't go to a 30th, even if a 30th was closer to the 50mm lens, I would still go a little bit faster. And here are the numbers again. 24mm lens, probably a 30th of a second. 50mm lens, a 60th, and so on. The numbers match exactly all the way up from there. What does a histogram show you? What's its purpose? What does it actually do? Again, this will be a little easier on the test because you will have 4 answers to pick from rather than having to write it from scratch. So the answer is, it's the graphical representation of the ratio of light pixels to dark pixels. And the ratio is the important word here. How many, it doesn't show you how many in actual numbers. It's just in relationship, how many dark compared to light. Is this more likely the histogram of a high key image or a low key image? We actually did this already as well, so this one should be pretty easy. All right. It is, whoops. Looks like my answer is missing. It is a low key image because the pixels are shifted to the left. Not sure why the answer is missing, but it is. What file format records more data, JPEG or RAW? Should be easy again because we just talked about this. And it is RAW. About 8,000 times more. So what is meant by a hard light source as opposed to a softer light source? How do you achieve hard light as opposed to soft light? What is it that we're actually talking about when we're talking about hard light as opposed to soft light? Amelia, you may have been out. You might not have been in yet when we did this, when we talked about this. So, but it is a hard light source creates sharper and more defined shadows. Soft light creates softer shadows. And I think there might be another question relating to this. Yeah. So that's what we mean by a hard light source as opposed to a soft light source. But the next one is, how is each type of light source created? In other words, what's required for a light source to be considered hard or soft? And this is also something that we talked about a little earlier today. All right, is everybody in? It's size in relationship to the subject. That's really all it is. Harder light source is small in relationship to the subject, and a softer light source is larger in relationship to the subject. So this should be pretty easy. What compositional element is used in the following photo? We've already looked at this photo. So you should be able to grab this one. And these are the compositional elements to pick from. That's the image. Which one are we looking for, or looking at rather? I'll go back to the image. All right, so my answer on this is rule of thirds. You could make a case for leading line because of the tie-off leak coming in here, but that's a little more subtle than the placement of the image. So rule of thirds is what I would go with there. All right, so same thing, which compositional element is used? We've already talked about this particular image as well, so this should be easy. There we go. And it is balanced. Again, possibly rule of thirds, but because we have two elements in the image that are playing against each other, it's more likely balance. Same question, what compositional element? Again, we looked at this. I'll give you this answer this because I've already given it to you. It's leading lines. Really not too many other ones that you could look at for this. I mean, that one's so overpowering that I don't think that it could be anything else. So the next few questions are still, they're all like this, but I think we probably looked at these already. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time. We'll just kind of look at them. So this one we talked about could have been leading lines, but it's convergence because the lines actually lead us to a single point, and that's the difference between those two. And then this one, like we said, convergence typically leads to a single point. same question, and we looked at this. This one is framing as well. Same question. Again, you might want to just jot them down just so you keep them in order. That's the photo, and it is either perspective or viewpoint. Either one would be correct. Then we look at this image, which we talked about. It is rule of thirds, but particularly its simplicity. And this one, we also talked about being symmetry, top and bottom symmetry. So the next question is, what is generally more powerful and dynamic in an image, verticals and horizontals or diagonals and triangles? So this one, I'll wait to see the hands go up. All right, it is diagonals and triangles. Horizontals and verticals are generally thought of as rather static. Diagonals and triangles create more motion. And the last question, which would be a more appropriate lens for a Head and Shoulders portrait and why? A 24 millimeter or an 85 millimeter? All right, the answer is an 85 because a 24 on a Head and Shoulders portrait would create distortion due to its proximity to the subject. All right, I'm going to stop that. So when you look back at your check marks as opposed to your X's, that'll give you a pretty good indication for whether or not you need to bone up a little bit more. And when you compare it against the PDF file, then you'll know exactly what you need to bone up on, if anything. The questions, like I said, on the test are going to be a little bit, because of the formatting, they'll be a little easier in that they are all multiple choice, I think. There might be one or two that will require a brief statement, but I'm not sure. I can't remember. But for the most part, they're multiple choice, so that makes it a little bit easier. Yes, it is better to guess if you don't know, because leaving it blank is an automatic miss. So even if you're not sure, guess, you've got at least a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. So the test is 25%, as we talked about earlier in the semester. It's 25% of the overall grade. So you've all pretty much established yourselves right now in a pretty good position, so that unless you totally bomb this test, which I don't expect really from anybody, I think you're all going to be okay. I think some of you are better than okay, but I don't want to overemphasize or we went into a lot of detail here, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea for the types of things that you're going to need to know or at least have access to. So was there anything as you went through there, let me guess, if there was one thing that probably gave you more trouble than anything else, it was all the exposure stuff, right? The exposure triangle, stuff like that. Yeah, and that's pretty much what it is with everybody. So I would really recommend, if you haven't already, download that chart that shows you which side is darker, which side is brighter. Have that printed out right next to you, and hopefully, if you understand exactly how it works, you can figure these things out. You don't have to know it in your head. You don't have to have it memorized. But if you can look at that and figure it out, then you're in good shape. So what'll happen next week, at the time of our class, we actually aren't going to meet. We won't have a Zoom meeting next week, but right at 4 o'clock, I will send out an announcement through Sakai which will have a link on it to the test. And you'll have the full class time. You'll have the full 2.5 hours to take it. To be honest with you, you can do it in a fraction of that. I've had people finish the test in as little as 15 minutes. I've had others that have taken an hour just because they want to really go back through it several times and make sure. You'll have that opportunity. You'll be able to go back and review your answers, go back and change your answers or whatever until you get to the point where you hit submit at the very last screen. So, if you want to go back and double check, you'll have that ability without, don't worry about it sending it through until you're all finished. If there's anybody who cannot be available at that time, you need to email me and tell me when you are available, and we'll work out. The thing is that I don't want to give anybody more of an advantage than anybody else, and so everybody's going to have the same amount of time to work on this. So if you can't be available at 4 o'clock next Tuesday, but you're going to be available at 3 o'clock on Wednesday, just let me know. As long as it's sometime next week after the 4 p.m. Tuesday time, I'll try to accommodate that and get you that link right about that time so that you can take it. Once all the tests are reviewed, I will, I think there's a place on there for me to actually post the test scores, and then I will enter in the final grade. And I think you guys probably get something automatically based on that. I'm not sure. But I'll probably send out an email, like an individual email to each one of you too, just so you have an idea for what you did and, where you ended up and all of that. Anybody have any questions about what's going to happen, how that process is going to work, or any questions about anything at all at this point before we cut you loose? Well, good. I am a little disappointed that we didn't have more people here, but hopefully they're going to download and watch this. I'll have this. It takes a little while. The only reason I don't get it up right away, post this video right away, is it takes several hours for the site to process it, and then it takes several more once it's uploaded for YouTube to actually process it on their end, make sure that there's, they check it against all sorts of things to make sure there's nothing inflammatory or, whatever. So anyway, it might be later tonight, it might be tomorrow, but as soon as I have that link, I'll send that out. And if you want to go back and look at any of it, and for anybody who wasn't here, they'll be able to watch from the beginning. So outside of that, guys, this was a challenge to do everything this way. This is the first. I did a little bit of this last semester, but we started the semester face-to-face and finished it this way. This was the first one that we did completely by remote. And it was a challenge, but I think everybody learned some things. I know I did. I learned how to make a few things a little more efficient. The real challenge is going to be next semester if we have the advanced class, which looks like we will at this point. I think we're only a couple of people short of meeting that minimum. That's a little more face-to-face and hands-on, but I'll tell you that if the timeline on everything with this pandemic follows the way they're saying it right now, there is a good possibility that that whole semester will be remote as well. I'm just not going to do it until the vaccines have been generally distributed to the general public. I like the fact that they're doing frontline workers and everything first, but that doesn't really do us any good. And I think a lot of us probably have situations where, it's just not a good idea, not necessarily for ourselves, but exposing other people to that. So I'll find a way to do that class. This one, I kind of know now we can do it all the way through. The other one, if I have to, I'll find a way. And if I don't, if there's a way around it, it is easier with a smaller class. If we only have, if we have less than 10 people to get in and, maintain some distance and do that, I'll try that if it's possible. But at this point, we're going to try to do everything remotely. So I had a good time. You guys, you were a pretty good group. Like overall, we had a little bit of everything here. And as tough as it can be to build energy remotely like this, I think you all did a pretty good job on your end. I hope that it wasn't so boring on your end sitting here and listening to me all the time, but I was pretty happy. I was really happy with a lot of the work that was turned in. Also going to tell you that especially for those of you that are thinking about going on and taking the advanced class, I was approached by somebody from Artworks Around Town, which is an art group based out of Center Market in Wheeling, who has offered us a 2-month window at the gallery down there to display and possibly sell artwork. I think it's going to be, I have to go back and look. I want to say it was April and May of next year. So if any of you are interested in doing that, let me know. And if you're not able to, you know, make physical prints to hang and to sell, let me know. I can probably do that for you. You know, we'll work out the pricing on it will basically be whatever it costs me. So it'll be pretty inexpensive. But it's a pretty cool place to display work like that. They get a lot of traffic through there, and a lot of the stuff does get sold. So and gets sold for pretty, you know, especially the bigger pieces get sold for a lot of money. So, you know, if you can, you know, invest a little bit or maybe nothing even at all, and walk away with a few bucks in your pocket, it might be worth it. So let me know if you're interested, and I'll continue to have a dialogue with them, and we'll get that set up before that comes up. I do think it's April and May, but I'll double check. All right, guys, that's it for not just today, but that's it for the semester, other than the test next week. And if there's anything I can do for any of you at all, let me know. Abby, I can tell how thrilled you are that this is done. No more rats. God knows what we'll see next semester. Yeah, so again, anything that pops up, if you have a question or a problem at all, let me know. You know where to find me. I'm a lot easier to find via email, even though I don't have an office on campus. I haven't been, have I even been on campus this semester? I don't think I have. No, I don't think I've had any reason to go up there. So, and so that you're all back home. So happy Thanksgiving. Have a great holiday season all the way through, guys. And like I said, if I can do anything, let me know. We'll be in touch soon. Bye-bye.